Rod Ovid here with another Take 5. This is something we bring to you every Monday through Saturday on our Facebook page for Rod Ovid and for Logos Institute of Biblical Studies. Today we begin a look at a story that will take us a few sessions. It's found in 3 different passages recorded by Mark, Matthew, and John. It's the story of Jesus walking on the water. And there's a lot to grab from it, so we're going to take our time, and I invite you to join us for this series. It's something that will just peel back the layers and have a good look at it. I'd like to begin by looking at the Mark passage. It's found in chapter 6, and it's 45 through 56. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida. And it said that he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. About the 4th watch of the night he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. As I said earlier, this story is told by 3 authors, and though the narrative is very similar, we get an entire picture by reviewing all 3. It's much like comparing the various statements from an accident scene, each telling things from their vantage point. And one invariably will miss details that another will include. So it is with this telling. Matthew, Mark, and John tell of the incident. Matthew provides the most detail of the storm, and he is also the only one who narrates the story of Peter's walking out into the waters. He also states that as a result of this incident, all the disciples confessed Jesus to be God's Son. Now, when we read John's account, we note that he mentions one of the reasons that Jesus left for the hills, basically that he feared that they would attempt to take him by force and make him king. Now, on seeing Jesus' miracle with the bread and fish, many wanted to make him king immediately. This no doubt would have pleased many of Jesus' followers, but for him it presented a possible temptation. That's most likely the reason he sent his disciples out early, as he escaped to the hills, where he could be alone and pray. Now what's interesting is we see in all accounts that a storm whips up. Sounds vaguely familiar to the time that Jesus told them to go across the lake, and they were all in the boat. Jesus was sleeping, and a storm came out of nowhere, and they thought they were going to drown. Seasoned fishermen, afraid they were going to drown. That tells you how fierce it must have been. And it seems like in this story, they're out there in the lake, and they're straining at the oars because the wind is so ferocious they cannot make any headway. So in both of these cases, there's a ferocious storm, and it is nighttime, and it's on the Sea of Galilee. Now that makes for some interesting conclusions on the part of the disciples. Number 1, everyone at that time had a fear of still, deep waters. Not so much of running waters, of a river. No one worried about that. But they believed that out in a deep, still body of water, they called it the abyss, and they believed that evil spirits lived there. And around some of the shore on Galilee, there were caves, and they also believed that spirits or ghosts lived in those caves. And so it wouldn't take a lot to their superstitious mind to believe that this was a spirit or a ghost walking on the water. And it was nighttime, and they're having a hard time, and they're fearful. What I'd like to focus on is the reaction that they had. And we come to verse 41 and 52, and it says they were completely amazed when Jesus got into the boat. And it mentions that the storm got quiet. They were amazed, and the word there means they were astonished. They were beyond belief. They were just set backward. And then we get this parenthetical statement explaining it for us in verse 52, for they had not understood about the loaves, their hearts were hardened. Now, this is where a lot of people get rather judgmental. Can you believe those guys? Their hearts were hardened. And what do we think of immediately when we read the words hardened heart in the Bible? You're right. 99% of people go right to the Pharaoh of Egypt. But you see, hardened in this text is from the Greek word parao. And there's another word that could have been used, sklerates. Now, had the authors used skelatres, that goes to motive. That tells us that they purposely hardened their heart. They would not believe. See, in both cases, both words mean a hardening, a callous skin, something forming over the heart. But the word you choose is based upon the intent and circumstances. Sklerates refers to a willful negative attitude that purposely rejects an idea, authority, or concept, where parao may have similar results, but most of the time it stems from the inability to see the truth. They did not, at that time, have the capacity to see the concept before them. This was clearly the case of the disciples. They were not expecting the Messiah to be God in the flesh, but rather a man, a prophet of sorts. So when confronted with godlike actions on the part of Jesus, they do not compute. They cannot see it. And that's why so often Jesus worked with them and say, don't you see it? Don't you see it? I mean, after all, he just fed 5,000 people. Probably 15,000 people with some loaves. Just a few loaves and fish. And yet they freak out when he walks on water and gets in the boat. Well, can't say I blame him. I think I would too. I think that would be mind-blowing. You know, that's why Paul reminds us that now we have the mind of Christ. The mind, in philosophical terms, is the ability to see the camouflaged soldiers among the rocks. And what Paul is saying there is because we now have the mind of Christ, we can see God through all the cosmic camouflage, all the evil one's lies, all of the distractions. We can see God because we have the mind of Christ. These disciples did not yet have the mind of Christ. There was nothing in their background, nothing in their intellect, nothing in their projections that would help them see Jesus as God. They had to learn that, and the Holy Spirit had to teach them that. So I'm glad that I can learn along with them through the Scriptures. Let's not judge them. Let's be thankful the truth has been laid out for us. So the question being, what are you going to do with that truth? Do you see Jesus as just a miracle worker, as someone you need when the chips are down? Or do you see him as God Almighty, able to change the weather, able to move mountains, able to rise from the dead, and certainly able to enter your life and make radical changes? He wants to, but we have to let him. So you think about that. You let him in today. You give him some authority in your life, and you know what? I guarantee you, you will have a blessed day.